Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here at Chatham House, an institution that I've heard of all my life, and it's my first time to actually be here, so I'm delighted to have the opportunity to do that, and thank you very much, Angie, for that generous introduction. The article that I wrote, some of you will know, but probably not all of you, it was triggered by a refugee crisis, rather different one from the one that we have today. The particular crisis occurred in what was then East Pakistan and is today Bangladesh. There was a movement for autonomy in East Pakistan that was brutally repressed by the Pakistani army, and as a result of that repression, 9 million people fled across the border into India. A barely imaginable number of refugees needing food, shelter, sanitation, and arriving in what was then a very poor country, a country certainly with less affluence than it has today. It would have clearly enormous difficulty. Any country would have enormous difficulty in coping with that number of people. I was at that time I'd finished my graduate work at Oxford, and I was just starting my first appointment as a junior lecturer at University College. Philosophy itself was emerging from a period in which most of the philosophers had thought that even moral philosophy is neutral on substantive issues. Philosophers like A.J. Ayer had said that the philosophy is not a guide to life, and people will be disappointed if they look to philosophy for guidance on how they ought to act. Because in his view, philosophy was, ethics anyway, was what we now call meta-ethics. That is, just saying what it is to make a moral judgment, not saying which moral judgments are better justified than others. But I'd say partly in response to the student movement of the 60s and concern with issues like Vietnam and racial discrimination, there was starting to be some philosophers who were interested in saying something about the major issues of the day. And I was encouraged to, this was something that I'd wanted to do. I'd been involved back in Australia before I went to Oxford in the anti-Vietnam War movement, and I was interested in writing about that. I was encouraged by my supervisor at the time, R.M. Hare, who later wrote a lot on applied ethics, and also by the establishment of a new journal called Philosophy and Public Affairs, which actually said that it wanted to contribute to the discussion of public issues and it thought that philosophy had a role to play. So I decided to write about something that I had been thinking about independently of the crisis in East Pakistan, namely, what are the obligations of people who are living in affluent countries and are reasonably comfortably off to help people in extreme poverty? But this particular crisis obviously gave a particular saliency to that issue, so I used it as the opening to ask whether people living in affluent countries were under an obligation, not just that it would be something nice, that it would be something supererogatory to do to contribute to supporting the refugees, but whether they were under an obligation to do something for them. And it was certainly not widely accepted at the time that there was any such obligation that we have to strangers, unless we have somehow voluntarily undertaken something, maybe entered into some relationships or made some promises. So to show that we do have obligations, at least in some case, or at least to try to argue this, to strangers for whom we have no prior responsibility, I told a little story, which has since perhaps become one of those famous philosophical examples, and I think has contributed to the popularity and the longevity of that article. I asked the readers to imagine that they were walking past a shallow pond in a park when they noticed that a small child had fallen into that pond. and it looked as if the child was going to drown. And although, of course, you would expect that there would be a parent or a babysitter who was looking after the child who would notice what was going on and rush in, you couldn't see any such person. It seemed like, anyway, there was only you and the child. And if you didn't run down to the pond as quickly as you could and jump in and rescue the child, it's quite likely that the child was going to drown. But I added a cost to you for rescuing the child. Not any kind of danger that you were going to drown in doing so. As I say, it was a shallow pond and you knew that. But as bad luck would have it, you were going somewhere important where you wanted to impress the people you were meeting, and you'd put on your best clothes, expensive new pair of shoes that you'd bought, and they were not made for leaping into muddy ponds, and they were going to get ruined as a result of that. So you were going to be up, apart from being late for your appointment, you were going to be up for the cost of replacing some of your newest and most expensive clothing. Then I asked the readers, so given that situation, what would you think of somebody who said, well, I don't want to ruin my nice clothes. This is not my child. I have no responsibility for this child, and I certainly did not push the child into the pond. So why don't I just go on my way? And I tried this out with students, and the pretty much unanimous reaction was, that would be wrong. That would be the wrong thing to do, to say, because you didn't want to ruin your shoes, you weren't going to save the child. You can't compare, people would say, a child's life with replacing your expensive clothing. So, given that, and assuming that most of my readers would react in that way, I said, if that is how you react, you're accepting that there are at least some circumstances where we do have obligations to help strangers, even though we have no responsibility for them or for the plight that they're in. And I suggested that what was crucial here to this obligation was the idea that there's something really bad happening, and the child drowning is a really bad thing that's happening. And although there is some cost to you, it's not in any way morally comparable. And I just left that notion of moral comparability at a kind of intuitive level. I didn't want to try to specify exactly what makes something morally comparable or not, because I know that people will have different standards. But I think most people looking at that situation would agree that the cost was not morally comparable. But then, I continued, if it would be seriously wrong to leave that child because you didn't want to be up for the expense of replacing their clothing, is that really morally different from the situation that we are in with regard to the refugees in India? Or for that matter, more generally, with people in extreme poverty where that means that their children die at a higher rate, they have a much shorter life expectancy, or they're suffering in all sorts of ways. So I wanted then to, in other words, extend this child in the pond example to our situation as people who are living in affluent societies, and at least not the poorest of those people living in affluent societies. Let's say at least at a middle class level. And I wanted to argue that we can save lives or help people in developing countries without making a morally comparably significant sacrifice. And in fact, I thought at the time that for the cost of your expensive clothing, you could save a life. There's now better research about how much it costs to save a life. Obviously, it varies depending on what you're doing. It may still be true that for the cost of a really expensive pair of shoes, you can save a life, but probably most of us are not in the market for those shoes. So, you know, maybe I have to put it a little higher. Maybe the sacrifice has to be a little bit greater than I then thought it was. But still, there are things that, for most middle-class people in affluent societies, you can give away that amount of money without making any really big dent in your lifestyle. So that was really my argument, as simple as that, that there was something really bad happening. That is, people are dying prematurely or suffering from lack of some basic resources, that we have the means to help them. That's, of course, an important factual premise. And the moral premise that if we can prevent something bad happening like that at a relatively modest cost to ourselves, then we ought to do it. And then the rest of the article, I dealt with a number of obvious objections to that argument. And over the years, I've come back to that topic a few times, including a couple of other essays that are reprinted with the original essay in that volume, and some of the books that Angie mentioned, The Life You Can Save and The Most Good You Can Do. I'm going to allow plenty of time for questions and discussion, so I'm not going to go into all of those objections and my responses now. I imagine that you'll be able to think of quite a few of them, and I'll give you my answers to that when we come to question time. But I do want to say a little bit about, if you like, the history of that article and why I think OUP decided that this was a good time to reprint it and put it out as a book. I think there's been an interesting change in the perception of that essay over the years. Not that it was ever really neglected. I think it was, you know, for a successful essay pretty much from the time it appeared. People started talking about it. It started getting reprinted in anthologies reasonably early on, and it's been very widely reprinted in anthologies. So a lot of students over the years have come across that example. But the way it was put to students, I think, has changed. And this was brought home to me a couple of years ago when I was talking about the issues of obligations to help strangers at Harvard University. And I was introduced by Josh Green, who's now a professor of psychology at Harvard, but had studied philosophy. And he was at Harvard, and he said that when he was taught that essay, I don't know, 10, 15 years earlier, his professors had presented them with the argument and basically said, look, here's what seems to be a plausible argument. The premises seem to be ones that are difficult to deny. The conclusion appears to follow from the premises. But the conclusion can't be right, because if the conclusion is right, then we're all doing something wrong, or nearly all of us are doing something wrong, because we're not basically giving significant sums to help people in extreme poverty. So if this article is right, then morality is much more demanding than we all think, and that can't be the case. So where does the argument go wrong? It was kind of, you know, in that sense, a philosophical puzzle. Good teaching tool, of course, to challenge students in that way and get them to find the flaws in an argument, but with that assumption. And Josh Green then was looking at the audience in front of me a couple of years ago and saying, clearly something has changed, because I know that there are people here. In fact, the event was organized by a group called, I can't remember the exact title, it was something like Harvard Students for High Impact Philanthropy or something like that. So he said, you know, I know there are people here who are actually wanting more people to act in accordance with this argument. And that's a really interesting change. And what it relates to is the development of a movement that's now called effective altruism. The development of a movement really started among students, some of them philosophers, people like Toby Ord at Oxford, who started a group called Giving What We Can, but not all of them philosophers, but people who thought that, firstly, we ought to be doing more to help strangers, that there's something wrong with the world in which we're living, in which there are so many affluent people not doing anything for strangers, and still a lot of very poor people who need assistance. And secondly, that we need to be more aware of the importance of evidence in knowing to which organisations we should donate. Because the philanthropy sector has actually not taken very seriously evidence of impact. There hasn't really been anything that corresponds to, what do you call it in this country? Is it Which magazine that tells you which is the best dishwasher to buy, right? Assesses them and helps you get best value for money. There hasn't really been anything like that until very recently in the philanthropy field. There have been some websites that have told you how much a charity spends on its administrative and fundraising expenses. That information is not difficult to obtain, but it's also not really very useful. Because if you fire all of your field staff, then you're going to reduce your administrative expenses. You can still receive money. You can hand out grants to organisations in developing countries who apply for money, but you have no idea whether the money you're handing out is doing any good or not. So cutting administrative costs isn't necessarily the best way to get good value for your money. But actually seeing what impact organisations have, are they achieving what they want to achieve? Is what they want to achieve making a real difference in the well-being of the people that they're helping? That's much more difficult to get that information. And it's really only in the last decade or so that we've had good studies looking at that for a variety of things that aid organisations do. And it's only in the last decade that we've had organisations online that have tried to research that. And Giving What We Can is one in the UK that does that. In the US, there's one called GiveWell. There's an organisation that developed out of one of my earlier books called The Life You Can Save. They're all trying to assess organisations in that way. So this movement, effective altruism, based on using reason and evidence to work out where you get the biggest impact, I think has been an important factor in helping people to see that this is something that's really worth doing, that you don't have to worry about your money disappearing down a black hole and not doing any good, because you can know that it is helping. And I think that has been in the past a major barrier to people actually taking this argument in a practical way and living in accord with it. Now that that barrier is at least partly overcome, now that we've also got some very public examples of people like Bill and Melinda Gates who are using their enormous resources to try to make a difference in the world, I think we have a new approach to this, and I think it is actually working. I think we're seeing results in terms of child mortality falling in developing countries, in terms of the number of people who are going to bed hungry falling. Of course, this is not all due to aid. A lot of it is due to increased prosperity in developing countries. But I think there is good evidence that well-targeted aid makes a positive difference, and that's something which puts us in a position of saying, well, given this situation, don't I have an obligation to at least do something significant in order to try to prevent the things that are happening in the world that we know are bad things, that we know it would be a better world if they were not happening. So I think with that, I'll conclude, and I'll look forward to your questions and discussion. Thank you.